about 2%. So actually, these industries, some of these much demonized nationalized sectors are actually performing quite well by international standards. But their big problem is that they weren't democratic. And I think that's my issue with the way that nationalisation happened in the past. There wasn't any semblance of economic democracy introduced to the nationalised industries after the war when the government had its big nationalisation programme. Most of the industries remained in the hands, or they were run by the very people who'd run the private sector very often. The best example of this is the first head of the National Coal Board, who was a guy called, anyone know? There was a guy called Lord Hindley, as he became. But before the war, he had been the manager of the biggest private coal firm, a firm called Powell Dufferin. And what did the Labour government do when they nationalised it? That they asked the private manager to come and run the coal board. And right through the whole nationalised industries, you had the same experience. You had people from industry being brought in to run the nationalised industries, or you had people even from the military being appointed to run parts of the national sectors. At no point was there any sense that there might be a more democratic way of running these industries. It was civil servants and people brought in from the formerly private industry sectors. The trade unions were very much in favour of some form of worker involvement, and there were even demands for consumer involvement in the industries, but it didn't happen. These industries remained very top-down, very undemocratic, and run by the same people very often that have been responsible for the running down of the private sector in the first place. And if you want a good contrast to that, look at the situation in France, where the government in France, despite having far more problems at the end of the Second World War than the British government in terms of rebuilding the French economy, the government in France actually instituted a far more radical form of nationalisation, with worker representatives, mainly through the Communist Party, which was strong in trade unions at the time, but also that they introduced consumer representatives onto boards of companies. And those elements of what's called co-determination have remained in the biggest French companies even today. If you look at other parts of Europe, of course, the post-war period saw a massive growth in economic democracy, the growth of worker representatives, even on the board of private companies in places like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Germany. Even today, most big Danish, Swedish, and indeed Norwegian companies have to have something like a third of their directors have been made up from the workforce, elected members of the workforce. So economic democracy was alive and well in the 1940s, but not in Britain, and it remains very much there in other countries even today. I think we have a problem in the UK. We have a problem with privatisation and the way it's happened. We also have a problem with nationalisation as it happened in the past. And I think the narrative that we need to develop is that we want to rethink our approach to the economy through new forms of public ownership. We're not going back to privatisation, but we're not going to go back to those over-centralised, bureaucratic, undemocratic forms that we had in the past. And the good news in all this is that, in fact, although private ownership and a kind of marketisation of the economy seems to be sacrosanct in the UK, it's not the case elsewhere. In many other countries, many other parts of the world, there's a real revolt going on, a real rebellion against privatisation and its effects. It started off in Latin America, where what became known as the water wars happened in the late 1990s, when in Bolivia, to start with, there was a real reaction amongst the general public to the privatisation of water services in places like La Paz and Cochabamba, because one of the first things that the water companies did was to raise the price of water, which actually for many poorer people in Bolivia meant the living costs actually rocketed, and that produced a reaction and a rebellion, and very, very quickly, within the space of 3 or 4 years, we saw privatisation being pushed back in large parts of Latin America, where various governments and cities and regions decided to take back the water supply to public ownership. And that has been a process that's rolled out across the world. Something like 86 cities around the world have taken back their water services into public ownership from private contracts in the period since 2000. And they're in places that you wouldn't normally expect. Atlanta, Houston, and many other US cities, having privatised or at least given out private franchises for run their local water services, have actually taken back public control in the last few years. Berlin and Paris are the two big European cities, but also places like Toulouse have actually seen water coming back under public ownership. And as well as that return to public ownership, we're also seeing some real innovation in the kinds of forms of ownership that's being put forward. We're seeing all sorts of interesting democratic, more participatory and more hybrid models developing. One example is in Buenos Aires, where the water sector was handed over to a US private consortium in the 1990s. There were big protests, again, price rises, and the Argentinian government in the early 2000s, in the post-crisis Argentinian government came in, decided to allow them take it back into public ownership of many local water services. And in Buenos Aires, what they did is they replaced the US private consortium with a Buenos Aires public company, which was half of the shares were controlled by the local water and sanitation trade union, and half held by the local city council. And that kind of model of more hybrid forms of local public ownership is actually becoming quite prevalent in lots of parts of the world. The country that I know most about, because I've spent a bit of time in the last few years researching, is actually Germany, where they've had a similar experience of energy privatization that we have here. Similar issues. It's a oligopoly, or under privatization, the German energy sector has become an oligopoly run by 4 big firms. Prices have remained high, and indeed up until very recently, the 4 big firms set their face against shifting away from carbon and nuclear to more renewable energy solutions. And as a result of that, there's been a growing demand by many parts of Germany that the whole sector should come back into public ownership. So we've seen a number of cities and regions across the country reclaiming their energy systems from the private sector. It's worth saying that in Germany the energy sector is very decentralized. So many of the electricity distribution networks are run at the local level by cities and by regions, and even some of the power generation is done at a more regional level. So there have been some really interesting developments in Germany, I think, in the last few years. The 2 largest German states, Nord Rhine-Westphalia, which is the largest state, the state that encompasses cities like Cologne and Düsseldorf and Bonn, they've recently taken back one of the big power and energy generating companies into public hands. And Baden-Württemberg, which is the region around Stuttgart in the south, has again basically decided to take back one of the big privatized regional energy companies into public ownership. But alongside that, I think even more interesting, more radical, is the number of cities in Germany that are part of what's become known as the German remunicipalization wave. 44 cities in Germany have set up new state-owned or local state-owned energy companies, new municipal energy companies, which in Germany are given the term they're called Stadtwerke. And what these cities are trying to do is they're trying to bypass the big privatized energy suppliers by creating their own local integrated energy companies, so that they can both produce their own renewable energy, combined heat and power, solar, wind power and so on, but also take charge of the electricity distribution network at the same time. And that's a growth of 44 new municipal companies has been in the last decade or so. But behind all this big challenge to privatization is one common denominator: the desire of public authorities to take back core services and infrastructure under their control after decades of poor performance, overpricing, and basically the failure to modernize utility networks. All sounds very familiar. But I think at a very pragmatic level, what you're finding in Germany is the cash-strapped public authorities, particularly in a time of austerity, are realizing that the energy sector represents quite a big revenue stream. You know, energy companies, electricity companies actually produce, they're not a big drain on the public purse, but they produce quite big returns. And in the UK, of course, they produce very big returns without needing, there's no real risk, there's very little risk, of course, because of course they're an essential service and private companies that's very attractive to them. But in Germany, they realise that actually, if you take back these energy companies, you can use the returns that come from energy to finance other parts of public services. So in Frankfurt, for example, where they have a local public energy company called Mainova, after the river Main that runs through the city, the energy company, Mine is a not-for-profit company, which has to invest quite a bit of its revenues that it gets into public services, like maintaining the city's swimming pools and maintaining the transport network of the city of Frankfurt. Okay, so a very good example of how German cities are realizing that we need to take back control of the revenues as well as the organisation of our energy resources to make sure it benefits the public purse. And in some other parts of Germany, actually there's far more radical things happening. If you look at Berlin and Hamburg, they've had recent referendums in those cities which have been won to basically take back control of private energy sector to develop a far more democratic form of organisation and do some more radical things. In Hamburg, they're committed to kind of citizen, what they call a new sort of citizen participation in the energy sector by having a much more democratically elected board. And instead of having the normal commercial targets that you get with energy companies, the energy company will have responsibility for things like developing a much more effective renewable policy, producing clean energy, but also cheaper energy for the consumers, and actually encouraging a more efficient use of energy, and actually more efficient, also getting into the design of buildings and housing for consumers as a way of, if you like, redistributing the profits that come out of the energy company into a much better sort of set of public services and public needs. So I think there's some really interesting examples there that we can think about in the UK that could really energise our arguments and our demands for new forms of public ownership. The other, conscious of time, the other place I've talked about a lot in my book, and I'll mention today, is Denmark, where it's the country that's probably been the biggest pioneer in the 1980s and 90s of renewable energy, particularly wind power. The Danes created 20,000 jobs in the wind power sector as a result of their shift into the wind power sector, and they've had made major advances in turbine manufacturing and technology and benefited from the growing US market. But the most remarkable thing about the Danish success story in wind power is that it was largely built around public rather than private investment and structures. The Danish government decided in the early 1980s, largely in the wake of the oil crisis, that it would shift the energy sector away from imported oil to renewable power. This was a big risk at the time, because not many other countries were doing it, and many other European countries invested in nuclear in the 1970s as a way out of dependence on oil and gas. But in Denmark, they had a grassroots movement, a set of resistances against nuclear power, which forced the government to, if you like, effectively adopt renewables. Now, the most interesting part about the renewable story is their own public ownership in that, because what the Danish government did is they basically created lots of incentives for the production of renewables and the growth of wind turbines, tax incentives. They gave guaranteed prices for people producing wind power into the electricity grid, these kind of things that have become commonplace elsewhere now. But the other thing they did is that they set up a whole set of local ownership criteria, whereby if you wanted to own a wind turbine, you had to actually reside in the area where the wind turbine was being built. Interestingly, what this did is it encouraged people to get together and create their own cooperatives to achieve sort of critical mass and economies of scale. So 30 years later, we had a situation where we had a successful renewable wind power sector, which was largely run by families and local cooperatives. 1 in 7 families in Denmark by 2000 had a share in a wind farm. A remarkable example of people becoming engaged in the economy in the energy sector in a very dramatic way. And most of these new forms of ownership were actually cooperatives. So up until 2000, I think something like 80% of the sector was basically cooperatively owned. And since then, we've seen local governments getting together to create their own forms of energy and renewables after that. A very interesting development recently has been the development of an offshore wind farm off Copenhagen, which was built in the early 2000s. And at the time, it was the largest offshore wind farm in the world. think it supplied about 4% of Copenhagen's total energy requirements. And that was a very interesting form of organisation because it was 50% owned by the local city council and 50% owned by a residents' cooperative where 10,000 residents bought shares in the cooperative. So there's very interesting examples around the world, but particularly in the energy sector, of how new forms of more democratic, collective and public ownership are being used for progressive policy purposes, in this case for tackling climate change and dealing with renewables. And I think in the UK, perhaps we need to think long and hard about when we make arguments for public ownership, about how we draw upon these examples from things that are happening elsewhere to say, well, actually things could be different here. We don't want to go back to 1970 and older forms of nationalisation, but we can use new forms of more decentralised public ownership if we're going to solve some of the problems that we face in the years ahead. And I think the Nordic and the German traditions are very, very important for us here in the UK, because I think that there's a much more longer-standing tradition in many Northern European countries that strategic assets and national resources are something that should belong to everybody. They're not things that should be allowed to be captured by private or vested interests, but actually these things, even conservatives in lots of parts of Germany and Scandinavia will agree with the basic premise that natural resources in particular should be commonly owned. They should be commonly owned and they should be run on behalf of all of us, and we should be collectively involved in deciding how they should run. So I think we need to sort of really get off the back foot here in developing our agenda around public ownership to begin to make arguments about how our economy can really be run very, very differently, run also in the interests of all of us in the long term, rather than being captured as it is at the moment for short-term profit-making opportunities for particular sets of vested interests. Thank you very much.
Okay, before the question and answer, we'll just take a 2 or 3 minute break, just for anybody who wants to leave and anybody who wants to just stand up, maybe go to the toilet or get a breath of fresh air. Okay, we'll just take a 2 minute break. Alright, thank you.